Today's lecture is over the history of public speaking. And no, this isn't a history class, but in any field that you study, it's good to know a bit about the background. And so today we're going to talk about two groups of individuals that helped pave the way for the field of public speaking as it is today, and whose influences we still feel in today's in the field today. We begin with a man named Socrates. Socrates is a name that I hope you have at least heard before. He lived from 469 to 399 BC. And among other things, he's known as being the founder of intellectual thought. Now, that particular expression took me a while to figure out. Founder of intellectual thought. What does that even mean? Well, in essence, it means this. Socrates was one of the first individuals, the first philosophers to teach that we should learn more than we have to know to get by. In his day and time, where he was living there in Athens, Greece, it was common for many people to only learn their craft or their trade. Whatever their family business was, that's all they learned, because that's all they needed to know to take over the family business. Socrates said we should strive to learn more than we have to know, that intellectual thought, to think for the sake of thinking. And he taught this to a new generation. Now, he believed in something that we've come to call just simply the ultimate truth, or the big T truth, which I will explain on a following slide. So we will come back to that. A number of things Socrates was known for were contrary to the ways of thinking of the day. But one thing that he did is he would challenge prominent citizens of Athens to debate in the streets. And he would typically win those debates and make whoever he challenged look like a fool in front of all of their peers. Now, he did this to enough of the wrong people that these prominent members of the community had Socrates arrested. And after he was arrested, he was charged with the crime of corrupting the mind or minds of the youth. Corrupting the minds of the youth. And this bore a hefty sentence. It was either exile or death, and they allowed him to choose. Socrates, instead of choosing the easy way out, the exile, where he would just leave Athens and never return, he chose death. His reasoning for that was that he felt like if he just left, everything he had ever taught would be forgotten. On this slide here, you see a painting, The Death of Socrates. And here you see, there in the middle, the man who's pointing up. That is Socrates, and he's issuing what's called the apology. He wasn't saying, I'm sorry for what I've done. Apology here means, here's my explanation, my reasoning, my logic behind why I am the way I am. But keep that finger pointed to the heavens in mind. We will come back to that as well. You see that he had close friends here that were all mourning his death. The cup that he's reaching for was a cup of what's called hemlock. That was the poison used for executions. But you see the man literally hanging on to him, hanging on his every word. This is the next man we're going to talk about. The man sitting there next to Socrates, his name is Plato. Now, Plato lived, and I don't give you any dates here because even philosophers can't seem to agree. Philosophers and historians can't seem to agree exactly when Plato lived. There's about a 30-year discrepancy. What everybody can agree on is that Plato was most likely a student of Socrates. Some say he was a peer of Socrates, so about the same age. Others say he was up to about 30 years younger or so, just depending upon when he was born. But he was a student of Socrates. Plato was the founder of the Academy at Athens, which was essentially the first college. Plato, like his teacher, also believed in the ultimate, or big T, truth. I told you we'd come back to that. And he explained this concept, the big T, truth, by what's called the allegory of the cave. And that's the next thing that we'll look at here. An allegory is a short story. So a short story of the cave, and we have an illustration of it. Here we have the cave. It's the main part of the picture. In the bottom left-hand side, you see a group of prisoners. These prisoners have been in this cave for their entire life. All they've ever seen is the lights and shadows cast on the wall in front of them, the upper left-hand side. So as far as they're concerned, that is reality. Everything is black and white in 2 dimensions. That's what they look like. That's what everything looks like. Now, up toward the top right-hand side of the picture, you see a man standing outside of the cave. That man used to be one of those prisoners, and he broke free of his chains, and he climbed out of the cave in his ascent to sunlight, and he went outside, and for the first time he saw color. He saw people. He saw 3 dimensions. He saw trees. He saw animals. He saw everything as it actually was. And he realized that everything was different than anything he'd ever imagined. Now, knowing this, he knew what he had to do. He had to go back to the cave and tell the other prisoners what he had seen. It wasn't within his power to free them, but he could share what he had seen. And so he went back to the cave, and he did just that. Now, this character is known as the philosopher king. And Plato and Socrates believed that in every generation, there's a few people who were chosen by the gods. They lived in a polytheistic society. There were a few people chosen by the gods to receive divine knowledge. And they were given information that normal people couldn't understand. So, when the philosopher king went back to the prisoners, he explained everything he had seen, but they couldn't understand it. In fact, as the traditional story goes, because they couldn't understand it, they feared him, this philosopher king, and they killed him. Plato believed that he was a philosopher king, that Socrates was a philosopher king. They were the ones that had that divine knowledge from above, some of the few in their generation, and normal people just couldn't understand it. So the ultimate, or big T, truth is that there is more to reality than normal people can understand, and only a few are given the gift of being able to understand real truth. Now we come to our third philosopher, another name I hope you're familiar with, and that is Aristotle. Aristotle lived from 394 to 322 BC, also in the region of Athens, Greece. Aristotle was a student of Plato and a teacher to Alexander the Great, which I always thought was very interesting. Unlike his teacher, Aristotle believed in what's called, well, we've simply termed it the little t truth. Little t truth doesn't have an allegory to explain it. The little t truth is essentially what you see is what you get. There is no bigger truth that has to be revealed to us from the gods. Aristotle believed that we can learn everything there was to know through science and through study. And to that end, he studied everything he could get his hands on. He worked diligently to learn all manner of different things, from astronomy to mathematics to, obviously, philosophy, botany, medicine as they knew it at the time. He was a very well-learned individual. Aristotle's most famous book is a book called Rhetoric. And all it is a compilation of his lecture notes from the academy at Athens. He was a teacher there alongside his teacher, Plato. Now that word rhetoric is one that's used quite often in the field of communication studies. And when we use it, typically this is what we mean. It's the definition brought to us by Aristotle. The definition of rhetoric is an ability in any particular case to see the available means of persuasion. So in other words, rhetoric is the ability to look at the audience in front of you and understand what it's going to take to persuade them to do something. So the words associated with persuasion with a particular audience. Along with that definition, Aristotle brought us some other ideas, the artistic and inartistic proofs. Aristotle was consumed with the idea of persuasion. So the inartistic proofs were evidence and testimony, much like we see in our courts of law today. Inartistic means they cannot be manipulated. They are completely trustworthy. So in Athenian court, which was not necessarily a criminal law system only, everything was decided in the courts. If you had evidence for or against something, or testimony that was allowed for or against something, it was considered complete proof and could not be questioned. The artistic proofs, you should be familiar with those if you've ever had an English class. That would be ethos, pathos, and logos. Artistic proofs means that it's kind of up to the listener as to how much they believe this proof. So artistic, it's in the eye of the beholder. Ethos is proof by speaker character or credibility. Pathos is proof by emotional appeal. And these will be the negative emotions like anger, frustration, and sadness. Logos is proof by reasoning, the application of logic. These are a huge, huge part of persuasion, and we will definitely talk about them throughout the semester. These concepts are not going away, so you need to learn them now and hold on to those ideas, ethos, pathos, and logos. Here we have another painting, The School of Athens by Raphael. And in this painting, you have a lot of people whom Raphael believed had changed the world. But the funny thing is, only 2 of them were ever actually at the Academy of Athens. You have famous mathematicians and astronomers, and even an artist named Raphael in here. He painted himself into his own painting because he felt he'd changed the world with his art. But the 2 I want to focus on are right there in the middle. So here we have a close-up. You have Plato and Aristotle. They're walking and talking. And the only reason I want to show you this is to help you remember something very important about these 2 individuals. They disagreed on something foundational, and that was where truth came from, how we learned what we know. So that's what they're talking about here as they walk. Plato is the one on the left. He's the older of the 2. And if you'll look at his hand, it's pointing up to the sky, just like Socrates was earlier. It became a kind of a symbol in paintings about these 2. Pointing up to the divine. The gods are the ones that reveal truth. That's what he believed. Then Aristotle on the right, he's pointing out to the world around him. He's saying, no, you got it wrong. What you see is what you get. We study the world around us and we learn all there is to know. So if you're trying to remember who believed what, come back to this picture mentally and remember who's doing what with their hands. Pointing up to the gods, to the divine, that's where truth comes from, or pointing out to the world and to these other people around him who've studied everything. That's where truth comes from. These 2 believe 2 very different things. Finally, we have a different group of people known as the Sophists. So the first 3 we talked about were the philosophers, very famous philosophers. Here we have this secondary group, the Sophists. And this was a group that stood fairly opposed to the philosophers. They were a very different group of people. They were among the first to make public speaking a profession, so they got paid for their speaking abilities. But unfortunately, history views them as abusers of public discourse, meaning they were seen as dishonest, abusers of the right and the privilege of being up in front of people and talking. So we'll kind of talk about three very well-known sophists. The first one is Protagoras. You can see when he lived there, 455 to 415 BC. Protagoras introduced debate. And even today in competitive debate, we still use his tactics. He was the first to introduce the idea that anyone could argue anything from either side. So in competitive debate today, the debaters will flip. They'll flip a coin for who gets for and who gets against, or affirmative and negative. This was an idea introduced by Protagoras, that you could argue either side. One of the things he was known for is he would go out into the streets, gather a group of people around him, and talk about some issue of the day. And he would argue to convince the entire audience of one side of the argument. And as soon as he convinced the entire audience to believe one side of the argument, he would say, "You know what? You're all fools for believing that. Let me tell you why." And then he would tear down everything he had just built up and argue the opposing side until everyone believed that. And they would pay him for it. This was entertainment. The second sophist here is Gorgias. And you can actually find a book written by Plato by that name. It's a book about Gorgias in a debate with Socrates. I told you that Socrates was known for debating people. Apparently they got into a debate once. But Gorgias was known for his silver tongue. He didn't invent poetry, but he was among the first to make it entertainment. Prior to this, as I understand it, poetry was a catharsis. You wrote it as a form of self-expression, and it was meant for you and maybe the people closest to you. It was intimate. But to read it out loud, it was considered taboo. And so this is why history kind of viewed him as an abuser of public discourse. So he got paid for entertainment because of his beautiful way of speaking, his silver tongue, his expression of poetry. Thirdly, we have Isocrates. Isocrates was the first, at least recorded, he was the first recorded speech writer. He wrote and sold speeches to people. So someone would come to him and say, "I have this event, I need to speak before the Senate, I need to have a speech written." So Isocrates would sit down and he would prepare an address and then give it to the person. They would pay him and they would go and deliver it. Isocrates didn't get the credit for it. He literally everything that he ever did had someone else's name on it. Until late in life, he realized he had no legacy. No one would remember his name because all of his work now had someone else's name. So he spent the latter part of his life teaching people how to write speeches. So essentially, my job today is founded upon some of the principles that he created about teaching the art of public speaking. But there's also still a fairly niche market for speech writers out there, for political campaigns, as well as corporations. They will hire people who specifically write speeches for various events, press releases, and those kinds of things. So it's still a job in the field today. This introduces you to two of the major groups who have formed what we do today in public speaking. As we move on through the semester, you will become more familiar with what they've done. We won't really talk about these individuals very often, but you will see how they've influenced what we do.